He smelled of the earth. Not the manicured gardens of St. Petersburg. No, he smelled of Siberian mud, of cheap tobacco, of sweat-soaked wool dried too many times by a peasant's fire. Grigori Yefimovich, a man whose hands were mapped with the calluses of 1,000 days of farm labor, stood in a room dripping with gold leaf and silk. The air was thick with French perfume, a cloying scent meant to mask the stench of political decay. He didn't belong, and he knew it. This wasn't a holy man. Not yet. This was a sinner, a horse thief, a drunkard, a brawler whose local village of Pokrovskoye knew him better for his appetites than his piety. He'd married, had children, and then one day he simply walked away. Walked for months, then years, a pilgrim searching for a God he felt in his bones but couldn't find in a church. His pilgrimage wasn't about finding purity. It was about understanding his own monstrous sins. His personal mantra, the word that pulsed in his blood, was destiny. He felt a pull, a divine gravity, dragging him west toward the heart of power. He arrived in St. Petersburg, a curiosity, a starets, a holy wanderer with eyes that burned. They were pale blue, almost translucent, yet they seemed to bore straight through the silks and jewels of the aristocrats who collected mystics like exotic pets. They'd listened to his crude, rambling parables about God's love for the simple Russian soil, their lips curled in amusement. A savage, a plaything. But two people in the palace didn't see a toy. They saw a last desperate prayer. Tsar Nicholas II, Emperor of all the Russias, was a man drowning in a title he never wanted. He was gentle, devoted, and utterly, tragically weak. His wife, the German-born Tsarina Alexandra, was the opposite, fiercely protective, deeply religious, and isolated by a court that despised her foreign blood. Her faith was a fortress, and inside that fortress she guarded a terrible secret. Their only son, the heir to the Romanov dynasty, Alexei, was dying. He suffered from hemophilia, the royal disease. A single bump, a minor scrape, could trigger unstoppable internal bleeding. The finest doctors in Europe had been summoned. They'd offered theories, prescribed potions, and shaken their heads in defeat. The empire had everything: armies, palaces, unimaginable wealth, but it couldn't save one small boy. Alexandra's prayers grew frantic. God had to send a sign, a healer, a man of the people. And then he came, smelling of the earth. The call came on a storm-lashed night in 1907. Alexei had fallen. His leg was swelling, turning a hideous dark purple. He was screaming, not crying, but screaming, a thin, high-pitched shriek of pure agony that echoed through the Alexander Palace. The doctors had given up. They stood by the silk-draped bed, their faces grim, waiting for the inevitable. Alexandra, her face a mask of terror, made the call she had been resisting: bring the peasant. Rasputin walked into the room. He ignored the doctors, the silent courtiers, the Tsar himself. He walked straight to the bed, his rough spun tunic a stark stain against the pristine white sheets. He knelt. He didn't touch the boy. He didn't produce any holy relics or magical charms. He just looked at Alexei. and he spoke. His voice was low, calm, a hypnotic murmur. He spoke of the Siberian plains, of the strength of the horses, of the warmth of the sun on a field of wheat. The screaming softened to whimpers. Rasputin placed a calloused hand on the boy's forehead. He prayed, a simple, rambling peasant's prayer. The air in the room changed. The panic receded. The tension broke like a fever. By morning, the bleeding had stopped. The doctors were speechless. They called it coincidence, hysterical suggestion, a temporary remission. Alexandra called it a miracle. She looked at this dirty, unkempt man, not as a peasant, but as an apostle sent by God himself. She had found her savior. But here's the detail they never tell you. After the miracle, a court attendant found Rasputin in an antechamber, slumped in a chair, drenched in sweat, pale and shaking as if he'd run for miles. It was as if he hadn't just prayed for the boy, but had somehow taken the boy's pain into himself. Was it the power of God, or a power far older, far more dangerous? What happens when an outcast with a terrifying gift gets his hands on the soul of an empire?
Power in St. Petersburg didn't smell like leather-bound books or political ink. It smelled of incense, vodka, and secrets. Rasputin was now drowning in all three. He was no longer just a guest. He was a fixture. Our friend, the Tsarina called him in her letters. He had his own apartment, a constant stream of visitors, and a direct line to the heart of the monarchy. Petitioners flocked to him, aristocrats seeking promotions, generals seeking favor, socialites seeking a thrill. They would kneel and kiss his dirty hands, hands that could supposedly heal a child or condemn a minister to political exile. The concrete reality of his new life was a sensory overload. The rough texture of his peasant clothes was replaced by fine silk robes, a gift from the Tsarina. The taste of cheap village vodka was replaced by the finest French cognac, which he drank straight from the bottle. He'd stumble through the gilded halls of the palace, his voice booming, his beard flecked with food, a whirlwind of chaos in a world built on rigid etiquette. He was a walking, breathing insult to the establishment, and they hated him for it. His destiny, as he saw it, had expanded. It wasn't just about saving Alexei. It was about saving Russia itself. He'd sit with the Tsar, a map of the vast empire spread between them, and point with a greasy finger. "The people need land, little father." He'd slur. "Don't listen to those men in their fancy uniforms. They have soft hands. They don't know the soil." Nicholas, desperate for an honest voice, listened. Ministers were dismissed, generals were reassigned, all on the word of the Siberian peasant. The rumors began to curdle. They whispered that he wasn't just the Tsarina's spiritual advisor. The city was flooded with crude, pornographic cartoons. Rasputin with the Tsarina, Rasputin with her daughters, Rasputin as the true puppeteer, his hands up the robes of the Tsar and Tsarina, making them dance. And here's the first twist. The rumors were, in a way, a lie. The bond between Rasputin and Alexandra wasn't sexual. It was far more dangerous. It was one of absolute, terrifying spiritual dependency. To her, His voice was the voice of God. To defy Rasputin was to defy the Almighty. A lover can be dismissed, a prophet cannot. The church that had once embraced him now saw a demon. One bishop, a former supporter named Hermogen, conspired to confront him. In a dark, incense-choked room, Hermogen and his allies held Rasputin down. They screamed prayers, held a crucifix to his face, and demanded the devil leave his body. It was a medieval exorcism in the heart of the 20th century. Rasputin didn't flinch. He just laughed. A deep, guttural laugh. He looked Hermogen in the eye, his gaze like chips of ice. "You think your little cross can touch me?" he snarled, breaking their grip with surprising strength. Then he delivered a curse, promising ruin upon them all. Within a year, Hermogen was stripped of his titles and exiled. He was untouchable. But every miracle has its price. Every time Alexei fell ill, Rasputin was summoned. And every time, the boy recovered. But the desperation grew. The royal family became more and more isolated, cocooned in their faith in this one man. They were deaf to the rumblings outside the palace walls, the screams of striking factory workers, the angry shouts of starving peasants, the quiet, methodical planning of revolutionaries in exile. Then came the summer of 1914. The air grew heavy, metallic. An archduke was assassinated in a city called Sarajevo. The great powers of Europe, bound by a web of foolish treaties and imperial pride, began sharpening their swords. Nicholas's advisors, the men with the soft hands, urged him to mobilize the army, to defend Russia's honor. Rasputin, they say, fell to his knees before the Tsar. He wasn't a politician, he was a peasant. He knew what war meant. It meant fields stripped of men. It meant fatherless children and starving villages. It was a vision of apocalypse. "Little father, don't do it," he begged, tears streaming down his face into his matted beard. "War will be the end of Russia. It will be the end of us all." For once, the Tsar didn't listen to our friend. He listened to his generals. On August 1st, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. Nicholas, in a fit of patriotic fervor, decided to go to the front lines to command his armies personally. It was a disastrous decision, leaving the government in chaos. He left the empire in the hands of his German wife, a woman already suspected of being a traitor, and the one man she trusted above all others. Rasputin stood over a map of Europe in the dead of night, a bottle of Madeira in his hand. The fate of 170 million people resting on the whispers he would pour into the Tsarina's ear. He had reached the pinnacle of his power. He stood over the soul of a dying empire, realizing victory tasted like ash. By the winter of 1916, St. Petersburg was a city of ghosts. The war had bled Russia white. Millions were dead. The people were starving. The capital, renamed Petrograd to sound less German, seethed with a cold, murderous rage. And all that rage had a name: Rasputin. He was no longer a holy man. He was the disease, the German spy, the dark force draining the life from Mother Russia. To save the monarchy, the cancer had to be cut out. and the surgeons would be the aristocrats themselves. The plot was born in the velvet-draped salons of the elite, led by a man who embodied all their privilege and decay, Prince Felix Yusupov. He was young, fabulously wealthy, and married to the Tsar's own niece. He saw himself as a patriot, a hero destined to save Russia. His plan was a masterpiece of cold-blooded betrayal. The bait would be irresistible. Yusupov would use his own palace on the Moika Canal, and he'd promise Rasputin a meeting with his beautiful wife, Irina, a woman whose beauty was legendary. Rasputin, with his infamous weakness for women, would surely come. On the night of December 29th, the air was so cold it felt like shattered glass. A car pulled up to Rasputin's apartment. Felix Yusupov, his face a mask of charming friendship, escorted the monk into the night. His co-conspirators, the Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich and the right-wing politician Vladimir Purishkevich, waited at the Moika Palace, their nerves screaming. They led Rasputin down to a cozy basement cellar specially prepared for the occasion. A fire crackled in the hearth. A gramophone played jaunty American tunes. On the table sat a platter of Rasputin's favorite chocolate pastries and several bottles of sweet Madeira wine. The pastries and the wine were laced with potassium cyanide to kill 5 men. Felix poured the wine. He offered the cakes. Rasputin talked, his voice a low rumble, speaking of God and his destiny to protect the Tsar and Tsarina. He drank a glass of the poisoned wine, then another, then a third. He didn't touch the cakes. He said they were too sweet. Felix watched, his heart hammering against his ribs. Nothing was happening. The monk should be convulsing on the floor. Instead, he was asking for some music, tapping his foot. The cyanide had failed. Panic began to crawl up Felix's spine. This wasn't a man. This was something else. Excusing himself, he ran upstairs to his co-conspirators. "It's not working," he hissed, his eyes wide with terror. They gave him a revolver. "Finish it," they whispered. Felix returned to the cellar, the cold metal of the gun hidden behind his back. He found Rasputin standing before a crystal crucifix. "Grigori Efimovich," Felix said, his voice shaking, "you had better look at the crucifix and say a prayer." Rasputin turned. As he did, Felix raised the gun and fired. The bullet ripped through Rasputin's chest. He gave a guttural roar and collapsed onto the bearskin rug. It was over. The conspirators rushed down. A doctor declared him dead. They toasted their victory upstairs, the relief so intense it was dizzying. Russia was saved. But Felix felt a gnawing unease. He had to see the body one more time. He walked back down the stairs into the silent cellar. Rasputin lay perfectly still, a dark stain spreading across his silk shirt. He leaned closer, peering at the face. And then the unthinkable happened. Rasputin's left eyelid fluttered open, then the right. The pale blue eyes, now filled with a terrifying, inhuman fury, stared straight at Felix. With a sound that was half scream, half roar, the dead man leapt to his feet. He lunged at Felix, foam flecking his lips, his fingers like claws, tearing an epaulet from Felix's uniform. "Felix, Felix," he bellowed, his voice a demonic rasp. He scrambled, wounded and bleeding, not away from his attackers, but towards them. He clawed his way up the stairs and burst out into the frozen courtyard, roaring into the night, a mythical beast refusing to die. Purishkevich, the politician, ran out after him, firing his own pistol. One shot missed, another hit him in the shoulder. A third shot, finally, struck him in the head. He fell into the snow. Even then, they weren't sure. They beat the motionless body with a steel club, crushing his skull. They wrapped him in a curtain, drove him to the Petrovsky Bridge, and dumped his body through a hole in the ice into the freezing Neva River. As they watched the dark water swallow the corpse, a chilling realization settled over them. They had not killed a man. They had given birth to a legend. They called him Savior. He knew he'd become the monster.
The murder didn't save Russia. It signed its death warrant. When the news reached Tsarina Alexandra, she let out a single, animalistic wail of grief. Her link to God had been severed. Her faith in the nobility, in her own people, shattered completely. She retreated into a world of prayer and paranoia, clutching one of Rasputin's old, worn boots as if it were a holy relic. The monarchy was now truly rudderless, sailing straight into the storm of revolution. Rasputin's body was found a few days later, frozen solid in the Neva. The autopsy revealed a final, haunting detail. His lungs were full of water. The poison, the bullets, the bludgeoning, none had killed him instantly. He had still been alive, fighting for breath under the ice. His arms were frozen above his head, as if he were pushing up, or perhaps fixed in a final macabre gesture of blessing. The assassination, meant to restore order, unleashed chaos. It proved to the Russian people that the aristocracy was a nest of decadent, incompetent murderers. The last vestiges of respect for the throne evaporated. Just weeks later, the bread riots began. The starving workers of Petrograd poured into the streets. The soldiers, ordered to fire on them, turned and joined them. The revolution had begun. The Tsar abdicated. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled for 300 years, was over in a matter of days. Before his death, Rasputin had written a letter to the Tsarina, a prophecy. Historians debate its authenticity, but its words echo with chilling accuracy. If I am killed by common assassins, you, Tsar of Russia, will have nothing to fear for your children. But if I am murdered by boyars, by nobles, then their hands will remain stained with my blood for 25 years, and they will leave Russia. Brother will kill brother, and for 25 years there will be no nobles in the country. Tsar of the land of Russia, if you hear the sound of the bell which will tell you that Grigori has been killed, you must know this. None of your family will remain alive for more than 2 years. They will be killed by the Russian people. 18 months later, in a stuffy, fortified house in Yekaterinburg, the former Tsar, Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children were herded into a basement. There was no trial, no ceremony, just a squad of Bolshevik executioners and the deafening roar of pistols. Rasputin's destiny
was finally, horribly complete. He wasn't the savior of the Romanovs. He was their angel of death, the catalyst for their destruction. His presence had so rotted the foundations of the monarchy that the entire structure collapsed the moment he was removed. History remembers the demon, the lecherous puppeteer, the mad monk. They remember the myths that he was unkillable, that he hypnotized the Tsarina, that he ruled Russia. But the truth is both simpler and more terrifying. He was a mirror, a dirty, cracked peasant's mirror held up to the face of a dying empire. And what it reflected back was a court so decadent, a ruler so weak, and a system so broken that it could be brought to its knees by one man with burning eyes and a terrifying gift. He was the symptom, not the disease. They pumped him full of poison and bullets. They bludgeoned his skull and drowned him in a frozen river. But they couldn't kill the story. Grigori Rasputin didn't just haunt the Romanovs. He haunts history itself.